Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something heavy. Something that demands both your full attention and a quiet kind of respect. Because the story we're about to tell isn't just history. It's the blueprint for how an entire nation got built and who got crushed in the building. Tonight, we're talking about what it was actually like to be a black worker in early 1900s America. Not the textbook version. Not the version with a single paragraph sandwiched between the invention of the automobile and the sinking of the Titanic. The real version. The version that smells like pine resin and coal dust and lye soap. The version where your body is the engine of an economy that pretends you don't exist. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what the earliest job you ever had was. The kind of job where the pay was questionable, the hours were unreasonable, and the only benefit was the vague promise that it would build character. I read them all, mostly because I'm convinced half of you had childhoods that would make a labor inspector weep. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle into whatever comfortable position your ancestors could only dream about, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually meant to be free in America when freedom came with an asterisk? What happened to the millions of black Americans who were technically no longer enslaved, but found themselves trapped in systems designed to extract the same labor for almost none of the pay? What did it feel like to wake up before dawn, knowing the cotton field, the coal mine, the turpentine camp, or the white woman's kitchen was waiting for you, and that your choices were between backbreaking work and starvation? How did a country that had just fought a war over the question of human bondage manage to reinvent slavery under a dozen different names in less than a generation? What did sharecropping really look like from the inside, when the landlord kept the books and you couldn't read them? What happened to the men who went into the coal mines of Alabama and never came back out? And how did black women manage to scrub, boil, and iron their way into building entire communities with nothing but wash tubs and sheer determination? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1907, somewhere in the deep cotton country of the Mississippi Delta. You're black. You're free. And if that sounds like a contradiction, well, you're about to find out exactly how right you are. The first thing that registers isn't sight. It's cold. Not a pleasant chill. Not the kind that makes you pull a quilt up and think cozy thoughts about autumn. This is a pre-dawn cold that's gotten personal. The kind that seeps through the gaps in the cabin walls, rises from the dirt floor, and wraps itself around your ankles like it's been waiting for you. You're lying on a mattress stuffed with corn shucks and cotton leavings that crunch every time you shift. The cabin is one room, maybe two if you're fortunate, and the roof leaks in a spot directly above where your youngest child sleeps. You patched it last month with a piece of flattened tin, but the rain doesn't care about your repairs. It finds its way in the same way the landlord finds his way into your share of the crop every autumn. Persistently and without apology, you sit up. The room smells like wood smoke from last night's fire, now reduced to a grey mound of ash, and the faint sweetness of fatback grease that's permanently embedded in the walls. There's a kerosene lamp on the table, but kerosene costs money, and money is the thing you have the least of in a system specifically designed to make sure you never have enough. So you dress in the dark. You know the layout of this room the way. You know the calluses on your hands by memory and repetition. Welcome to sharecropping, the great American compromise that somehow managed to be worse than what it replaced and simultaneously get praised as progress. Here's the thing about sharecropping that the stories don't emphasize enough. It wasn't just farming. It was an economic trap so elegantly designed that you could work yourself to the bone for an entire year and end up owing more than when you started. The system worked like this, and pay attention, because the math is where the cruelty lives. You don't own the land, you don't own the mule, you don't own the plow, the seed, the fertilizer, or in many cases even the cabin you sleep in. All of that belongs to the landowner. In exchange for the privilege of working his land, you'll give him a share of whatever you grow, usually half, sometimes more. But here's the catch. You still need to eat while the cotton's growing. You still need clothes, shoes for your children, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, maybe some molasses if you're feeling extravagant. And where do you get all of that? From the plantation store, of course. The one owned by the same man who owns the land. The prices at the plantation store aren't just high. They're a masterclass in creative accounting. A pound of salt pork that would cost 10 cents in town somehow costs 25 cents at the commissary. A sack of cornmeal that sells for a dime on the open market mysteriously doubles by the time it crosses the plantation threshold. Everything goes on credit. Everything gets recorded in a ledger that you're not allowed to see, kept in a handwriting you couldn't read even if they let you, and tallied up at the end of the year when it's time to settle. Settling. That's the word they use. It sounds civilized, like a gentleman's agreement. In practice, it's the moment when the landowner sits you down, opens that ledger, and informs you that after subtracting the cost of your supplies, your rent, your seed, your fertilizer, the use of the mule, and a handful of charges you don't recognize and can't question, you owe him $47. You worked from March to November. You picked until your fingers bled and your back locked up in ways that make grown men wince. You grew 2 bales of cotton, and you owe him $47. That debt carries over to the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. Some families stayed in debt to the same landowner for decades. Some inherited the debt from their parents. The system was so thorough, so complete in its capacity to extract labor without compensation, that historians would later call it slavery by another name. And they weren't being dramatic. But let's back up to your morning, because it's not even dawn yet, and you've got 12 hours of work ahead of you that would make a modern personal trainer file a workplace safety complaint. It's late spring, which means it's chopping season. If you've never chopped cotton, let me paint you a picture that your lower back will understand instinctively. You're walking down a row of young cotton plants, bent at the waist, using a hoe to thin the plants and remove the weeds that are trying to choke them. The rows are long, not long like a supermarket aisle, long like a country road that disappears into the shimmer of heat rising from the earth. You're bent over. You stay bent over. You'll be bent over for the next several hours, moving down the row one step at a time, chopping, pulling, chopping, pulling, while the sun climbs higher and the air gets thicker and the sweat soaks through your shirt and turns the soil around your feet into a muddy paste. Your children are out here too. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not a detail added for dramatic effect. By the time a sharecropper's child was 7 or 8 years old, they were expected in the field, not because their parents were negligent, because the system demanded every available hand. Every pair of small fingers that could pull a weed or drag a cotton sack was another fraction of a cent toward the debt that never seemed to shrink. School, when it existed at all for black children in the rural South, operated on a schedule built around the planting and harvest seasons, which meant your education lasted about 4 months out of the year, give or take, depending on whether the landowner felt generous enough to let you go. Here's what a typical day looks like in the life of a black sharecropping family around 1907. You're up before the sun. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is whatever you have. Cornbread made from the meal you bought on credit. Maybe some fatback or salt pork. Maybe a sweet potato left over from what you managed to grow in your garden patch, if the landowner allowed you a garden patch, which not all of them did. Coffee is a luxury. Most mornings it's just water from the well, which may or may not give you something unpleasant later in the week. You eat fast because the riding boss will be making his rounds, and being late to the field is the kind of mistake that follows you all the way to settling time. The riding boss is the foreman, the overseer by a new name, and his job is to make sure you're working at a pace that satisfies the landowner. He's usually on horseback, which means he can see you from a distance and you can hear him coming before you see him. The relationship between the riding boss and the field workers is exactly what you'd imagine. He has authority. You have a hoe. By midday, the heat in the Mississippi Delta is a physical presence. It's not just hot. It presses down on you like a hand on the back of your neck. The air doesn't move. The humidity wraps around you until breathing feels like drinking warm water. You might get a break for dinner, which is the midday meal, and it's more cornbread. Maybe some collard greens if the garden's producing. Maybe some beans. You eat sitting in whatever shade you can find, and then you go back. In the afternoon, the cotton rows stretch on ahead of you the same way they did in the morning, and your back has developed a complaint that won't be resolved for the rest of your natural life. By the time the light starts to change and the day's work is called, you've put in somewhere between 10 and 14 hours of physical labor. You walk back to the cabin. Your wife, who has been out in the same field doing the same work, starts supper. Your children collapse into whatever space is available. The cabin has no electricity. There's no running water. The privy is out back, and in the dark, it's an adventure nobody wants. Supper is cornbread again, fatback again. If it's autumn and the garden's been good to you, maybe there are sweet potatoes or black-eyed peas. On Sundays, if the hens are laying, you might have eggs. Meat beyond the salt pork is rare. Chicken is a Sunday luxury. And even then, you're eating the parts of the bird that the white family at the big house wouldn't touch. The neck, the feet, the gizzards, the back. And from these cast-off parts, black cooks created something extraordinary. A cuisine of resilience that turned poverty ingredients into dishes so flavorful they'd eventually be celebrated as the foundation of an entire culinary tradition. But right now, in this moment, you're not thinking about culinary tradition. You're thinking about the fact that your daughter's shoes have holes in them, and the commissary wants 35 cents for a pair that won't last the season. Let's talk about what happens when the cotton comes in, because this is where the physical misery reaches its peak and the economic injustice becomes undeniable. It's September, picking season. If chopping cotton was brutal, picking cotton is the thing that broke generations of bodies across 2.5 centuries of American agriculture. Here's what it involves. You carry a canvas sack, usually 9 to 12 feet long, slung over your shoulder. You move down the row, pulling the cotton bolls from the plants with both hands. The bolls are surrounded by a hard, dried shell called a burr, and the edges of that burr are sharp enough to cut your fingers open, which they do repeatedly, until the tips of your fingers are raw and bleeding, and you stop noticing because you have a daily quota to meet. A good picker could pull between 150 and 300 pounds of cotton in a day. Women and men picked side by side. Children picked alongside their parents, dragging smaller sacks or stuffing cotton into their mother's bags. You're bent over again because the cotton grows low and your sack gets heavier with every handful. When the sack is full, you haul it to the wagon, dump it, and go back. The sun is still brutal. The dust from the dried plants coats your lungs. By the end of picking season, your hands look like you've been fighting a thorn bush every day for 2 months, because in a sense, you have. And here's the kicker. After all of that, after the months of chopping, the months of picking, the bleeding fingers and the broken backs, you still might not come out ahead, because the price of cotton fluctuates, and the landowner sets the price, and the commissary ledger says you still owe, and the riding boss suggests that maybe next year you should plant a little more. There's no appeals process. There's no labor board. There's no union. If you complain, you might find yourself evicted. If you try to leave while you still owe, you might find yourself arrested. Vagrancy laws across the South made it a crime to be black and unemployed, which meant that leaving one exploitative arrangement without immediately entering another was technically illegal. This was freedom in the early 1900s South. The chains were gone. The economics were identical. But the cotton fields were only one part of the story, because the early 20th century South had an appetite for black labor that extended far beyond agriculture into industries so brutal and so deliberately hidden from public view that many Americans, even today, have never heard of them. And the first of those industries operated deep in the pine forests of Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas, where the air smelled like Christmas, and the working conditions smelled like something much worse. Let's talk about turpentine. If you've never heard of the turpentine camps, there's a reason for that. They operated in some of the most remote, isolated stretches of the American South, far from cities, far from newspapers, far from anyone who might have asked inconvenient questions about what was happening inside them. And what was happening inside them was, in many cases, a form of slavery that persisted well into the 20th century, decades after the 13th Amendment was supposed to have settled the question. The naval stores industry, which is the fancy name for the production of tar, pitch, and turpentine from pine trees, had been part of the Southern economy since colonial times. By the early 1900s, the long-leaf pine forests that stretched from the Carolinas down through Georgia and into Florida were the backbone of a multi-million-dollar industry. And the labor that made it all possible was overwhelmingly black. Here's how it worked. A turpentine operator, usually a white man with enough capital to lease thousands of acres of pine forest, would set up camp deep in the woods. And when I say deep, I mean miles from the nearest town, miles from a road, miles from anything that resembled civilization as you might recognize it. The camp itself consisted of a collection of rough cabins or shacks, a commissary, a distillery for processing the resin, and the personal quarters of the boss and his overseers. That's it. That was the whole world. Workers were recruited through labor agents who traveled through black communities in the South, promising good wages and steady work. Sometimes the recruiting was more direct. In many documented cases, local sheriffs and justices of the peace arrested black men on bogus charges, typically vagrancy or loitering or some other flexible misdemeanor, and then offered them a choice: go to jail or go to the turpentine camp. The camp operator would pay the fine, and the worker would be told he had to work off the debt. This was peonage, and it was technically illegal under federal law. But out in the pine forests, federal law was about as relevant as a weather report from another continent. Congratulations. You're now standing in a turpentine camp somewhere in the piney woods of northern Florida, circa 1909. The air is thick with the sweet, sharp smell of pine resin, which sounds pleasant until you realize you'll be smelling it constantly for the next several years of your life. That it seeps into your clothes, your skin, the walls of your cabin, and eventually your lungs. The trees around you are enormous longleaf pines, some of them 80 feet tall. And your job, the one you've been brought here to do, is to slash their bark and collect their blood. The process is called chipping, and it's as brutal as it sounds. You carry a tool called a hack, which is basically a curved blade on a long handle. Your job is to cut a series of grooves, called streaks, into the bark of the pine tree so that the resin flows down into a cup or gutter attached to the trunk. Each tree gets chipped multiple times over the season, and each worker is assigned a quota, typically somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 trees. Yes, you read that number correctly. 10,000 trees. Each one needs to be visited, chipped, and have its cup emptied into a barrel. Then you haul those barrels to the still. You do this from early spring through late autumn. You're out in the woods before dawn, working in terrain that includes palmetto scrub, standing water, rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and clouds of mosquitoes so thick they feel like a second atmosphere. The resin itself is incredibly sticky, and it gets everywhere. On your hands, your arms, your tools, your clothes. By the end of a workday, you're coated in the stuff, and it takes turpentine, ironically, to get it off. The chemicals burn your skin. The repetitive overhead motion of chipping destroys your shoulders and upper back. The isolation destroys everything else. And then there's the commissary. If the plantation store was a masterclass in economic exploitation, the Turpentine Camp Commissary was the advanced seminar. Because you're miles from the nearest town, the commissary is the only source of food, clothing, and supplies, and the prices are set by the same man who sets your wages, which means the math never works in your favor. Your annual bill for cornmeal, salt pork, cloth, and shoes always manages to exceed what you've earned. Always. The system was designed that way, as deliberately and as carefully as any cotton gin or railroad schedule. You can't quit because you owe money. You can't leave because the woods stretch for miles in every direction, and the boss has men on horseback, called woods riders, whose job is to make sure nobody wanders off. The woods riders were the overseers of the turpentine world, and their authority was absolute. They rode through the forest checking each worker's tally, the daily count of trees chipped and cups emptied. And God help you if the numbers didn't add up. Punishments ranged from docked pay to beatings. In the worst camps, and there were many, workers were whipped with cowhide straps, chained at night to prevent escape, and in documented cases, murdered and buried in shallow graves with no record and no consequence. In 1923, a series of hearings before the Florida legislature exposed conditions at camps owned by politically connected families, including testimony that 9 deaths in a single year at one camp had been falsely ruled natural by a compliant local coroner. A social worker who lived near the camp testified that the camp warden had shot a black woman and her daughter a week before the hearing. The senator who owned the camp was in attendance. He kept his seat. Here's the thing about the turpentine camps that makes them different from the cotton fields. In sharecropping, the exploitation was economic. The landlord took your labor through debt. In the turpentine camps, the exploitation was total. Your body, your movement, your time, your ability to leave were all controlled by a single man in a landscape where there were no witnesses, no newspapers, and no law that operated in your favor. Federal investigators would eventually identify these camps as sites of peonage, a form of forced labor that violated federal statutes going back to 1867. But prosecutions were rare, convictions rarer, and the camps operated with impunity well into the 1940s. Some historians argue they persisted in diminished form even later than that. And here's where we need to talk about something even darker, if that's possible. Because the turpentine camps and the cotton fields weren't the only places where black labor was being extracted by force in the early 1900s. There was another system, one that operated under the full blessing of state governments across the South, that took the concept of freedom and twisted it so thoroughly that the word became meaningless. It was called convict leasing, and if you've never heard of it, that's by design. Here's how convict leasing worked, and I want you to pay close attention because the simplicity of it is part of the horror. After the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, there was one very specific exception written into the text. Slavery and involuntary servitude were prohibited except as punishment for a crime. Except as punishment for a crime. Those 6 words became the trapdoor through which an entire population was re-enslaved. Southern states immediately began passing laws, the Black Codes and later Jim Crow statutes, that criminalized virtually every aspect of black daily life. Vagrancy, which could mean anything from being unemployed to standing on a street corner to walking down a road without proof of employment. Loitering, being out after dark, using obscene language, selling cotton after sunset, changing employers without permission, being unable to prove you had a job. Each of these was a misdemeanor, and each carried a fine. And when a black man or woman couldn't pay the fine, which was almost always, the state offered an alternative. You could work it off. The state would lease you to a private company, a coal mine, a railroad, a turpentine camp, a brick factory, a cotton plantation. The company paid the state for your labor, and you received nothing. You were housed in camps, often in old slave quarters or hastily constructed stockades. You were fed the minimum necessary to keep you working. You were worked from dawn to dusk and sometimes beyond. And if you died, and thousands did, you were replaced. Because unlike enslaved people before the war, who represented a significant capital investment to their owners, convict laborers were essentially free and disposable. The state could always arrest more. The scale of this system is staggering. By some estimates, as many as 200,000 black Americans were caught up in convict leasing between the 1870s and the 1920s. They built railroads, they mined coal, they manufactured bricks, they harvested timber. They did the most dangerous, most degrading, most physically destructive work the American economy had to offer, and they did it for nothing, while the companies that leased them made fortunes, and the state governments that supplied them collected fees. The coal mines of Alabama are where this story gets particularly grim, and I don't say that lightly given what we've already covered. Birmingham, in the early 1900s, was a city built on coal and iron, and the men who mined it were disproportionately black. The Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, known as TCI, was one of the largest employers in the region, and it used convict labor extensively. The conditions in the mines were nightmarish for everyone, but for convict laborers, they were something beyond that. Picture this. You're underground. The tunnel is narrow enough that you can touch both walls with your outstretched arms. The ceiling is low enough that you're working in a permanent crouch. Before electricity reached the mines, your only light was a gas headlamp attached to your cap, throwing a small pool of flickering illumination that only made the surrounding darkness feel more complete. The air is thick with coal dust. which coats your lungs with every breath. The floor is standing water in many shafts, and you're working in it, swinging a pick, shoveling coal, loading it into carts for 10 to 14 hours at a stretch. Every sound is amplified. The drip of water, the creak of timber supports, the distant rumble that might be a cart on rails or might be the mountain deciding it's had enough. The dangers were constant and varied. Roof collapses, methane gas explosions, suffocation from bad air, injuries from the heavy machinery that was gradually being introduced. Between 1880 and 1923, more than 70,000 miners died on the job across the American coal industry, and countless more died from occupational diseases that never made it into the official statistics. For convict laborers who received less food, worse medical care and more brutal treatment than free workers, the death rates were catastrophically higher. Disease swept through the camps in waves. Tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery from contaminated water. The sleeping quarters were cramped stockades where men were packed together with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no escape from the coughing, the fever, and the slow grinding attrition of bodies being used up and discarded. But here's the thing that's crucial to understand, and this is where the story of black workers in the early 1900s becomes something more than a catalogue of suffering. Not all black miners were convicts. In fact, by the turn of the century, African Americans made up more than half of the free mining workforce in Alabama. These were men who chose to go into the mines, not because the work was appealing, but because in a Jim Crow South that offered almost no other industrial employment to black men, the mines at least offered wages, and those wages, meager as they were, represented something that the cotton fields and the turpentine camps didn't. Cash money, not credit at a commissary, not a share of a crop that someone else would price. Actual currency that you could hold in your hand and spend where you chose. The coal companies knew this. They also knew that a workforce divided along racial lines was a workforce that wouldn't organize effectively, and they exploited that division with the calculated precision of men who understood that solidarity was bad for business. When white miners went on strike, the companies brought in black workers as strikebreakers. When black miners demanded better conditions, the companies pointed to the convict laborers who would do the same work for nothing. The racial wedge was driven deep, and it served the owners well. And yet, despite the manipulation, despite the deliberate division, something remarkable happened in the Alabama coalfields that deserves its own chapter in the story of American labor. Black and white miners began to organize together. The United Mine Workers of America, founded in 1890, adopted an explicitly interracial stance that was radical for its time and geography. In the Jim Crow South, where a black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman, black and white coal miners sat in the same union halls, paid the same dues, and went on strike together. By the turn of the century, the UMW in Alabama claimed 10,000 members, and African Americans were not just rank and file. They were local leaders, organizers, and delegates. Let's be clear about what this meant. In a state where black people were barred from voting, barred from serving on juries, barred from public office, and barred from most public spaces, the Coal Miners' Union was one of the only institutions in the entire South where black and white people worked together as something approaching equals. It wasn't perfect. White miners still harbored deep racial prejudices. The union's interracial solidarity was always fragile, always under attack from employers who understood that racism was the most effective tool for breaking labor power. But it existed. and its existence was an act of defiance against everything the Jim Crow South was designed to enforce. The 1908 coal strike in Birmingham was one of the most dramatic confrontations of this era, when District 20 of the UMW called for a walkout in July. Only about 4,000 of the 20,000 miners in the district joined on the first day. But by the end of the second week, more than half the workforce had walked out, and 30 new union locals had been formed. Armed confrontations erupted between strikers and company guards. The national press covered the story, and for a brief, incandescent moment, it looked like the workers might win. They didn't. The companies brought in strikebreakers. The state sent in troops. The union's finances collapsed under the strain of supporting thousands of families with no income. The strike was broken, and with it, the UMW's presence in Alabama was effectively destroyed for a generation. But the fact that it happened at all, that black and white workers stood together in the coalfields of Jim Crow, Alabama, and said no, is a piece of American history that doesn't get told nearly often enough. Now let's leave the mines and the forest for a moment and talk about the other half of the black workforce in the early 1900s, the half that history has arguably erased even more thoroughly. Because while black men were breaking their backs in cotton fields, coal shafts, and turpentine camps, black women were doing something equally grueling, equally essential, and equally invisible. They were doing the laundry. That might sound minor. It might sound like a footnote. Let me assure you, it was neither. In the early 1900s South, being a black woman and being a domestic worker were essentially synonymous. In cities like Atlanta, the numbers were staggering. 98% of black women who worked for wages were employed as domestic laborers in white households. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised white children while their own children were left with relatives or older siblings. They hauled water, emptied chamber pots, scrubbed floors, polished silver, and performed, as one historian put it, various and sundry tasks that the lady of the house preferred to avoid. And among all of these roles, one stood above the rest in both its physical brutality and its economic importance. The washerwoman. If you've never thought about what laundry involved before the invention of washing machines, electric irons, and running water, let me walk you through a week in the life of a black washerwoman around 1905. And I promise you'll never look at your laundry room the same way again. Monday was collection day. You'd walk through the white neighborhoods, sometimes several miles, picking up bundles of soiled clothing and linens from the households that employed you. These bundles were heavy. We're talking about a full family's worth of clothes, bed sheets, tablecloths, and undergarments, all of it filthy, all of it piled into baskets or cloth bags that you carried on your head or balanced on your hip. You might service 3 or 4 families, which meant multiple trips, or one trip with a load that would make a pack mule reconsider its career choices. Tuesday through Thursday was washing, and washing in this context was a full body, industrial operation conducted in your own backyard with equipment you'd often made yourself. You hauled water from a well or a pump, sometimes carrying it several hundred yards in heavy buckets. You heated the water over an open fire in large iron pots. You made your own soap from lye and rendered fat, a caustic mixture that ate away at your skin as efficiently as it ate away at stains. You scrubbed each garment on a washboard, a ridged metal or wooden surface that turned your knuckles raw and your forearms into ropes of sore muscle. You boiled the whites in the iron pot, stirring them with a long wooden paddle called a battling stick. You rinsed everything in clean water, which meant more hauling. You wrung each piece out by hand, twisting fabric until the water stopped flowing. and your wrists ached in places you didn't know wrists could ache. Then you hung everything to dry on lines strung across your yard, and you prayed it didn't rain, because if it rained, you started over. Friday and Saturday was ironing. The irons were heavy metal wedges that you heated on the stove or over the fire. They weighed between 5 and 8 pounds each, and you typically kept 2 or 3 going at once, rotating between them as they cooled. You pressed every shirt, every dress, every sheet, every tablecloth, every petticoat, to a standard that would have satisfied a military inspection, because your reputation and your livelihood depended on the crispness of your work. The heat from the irons, combined with the heat from the fire, turned your workspace into something approximating a sauna. In the summer, when the temperature outside was already in the 90s, the ironing was an endurance test that lasted hours. For all of this, a washerwoman in the early 1900s earned between $4 and $8 a month per month. To give you some context, that's roughly equivalent to between $100 and $200 in today's money for a month of work that would be classified as extreme physical labor by any modern standard. And yet, here's where the story turns, because black washerwomen didn't just endure this work, they transformed it into something powerful. The washerwoman's trade was one of the few occupations available to black women that offered a measure of autonomy. Unlike domestic servants who lived in or worked under the direct supervision of a white employer, washerwomen set their own hours. They worked in their own spaces. They controlled their own process. And crucially, they gathered in those spaces together. The backyard where the washing happened wasn't just a workplace. It was a community center. It was a space of conversation, of information sharing, of mutual support, and eventually, of political organizing. Multiple generations of women labored side by side, talking, laughing, and strategizing in a space that was free from white supervision and largely beyond white knowledge. The washtubs became a kind of sanctuary, a place where black women could speak freely about the conditions of their lives and begin to imagine something different. In Atlanta, in 1881, that imagination became action. 20 black washerwomen gathered in a church and formed the Washing Society. They set a uniform rate of $1 per dozen pounds of laundry and called for a citywide strike. Within 3 weeks, the strike had grown to include 3,000 members, 3,000 women, in a city where they had no right to vote, no political representation, and no legal protection, stood up and said that their labor was worth more than what they were being paid. The city panicked. White households suddenly discovered what it was like to live with dirty laundry, and it turns out they didn't enjoy the experience. The strikers were arrested, fined, and threatened. The newspapers called their demands unreasonable, but the women held firm. They went door to door, organizing support. They held daily meetings to maintain morale. They even brought in white washerwomen, mostly poor Irish immigrants, to join the cause, an act of interracial solidarity that was extraordinary for the era. The strike didn't achieve everything it demanded, but it shook the foundation of a city that had been confident in the invisibility and compliance of its black workforce. It inspired other domestic workers, cooks, and maids and nurses to demand better conditions, and it proved something that the power structure of the South found deeply threatening. Black women, the most marginalized, most exploited, most invisible workers in the American economy, could organize. They could resist, and they could make an entire city feel the absence of their labor. That's power. Quiet, calloused, soap-burned power. But power nonetheless. Now let's step inside the White household itself because the washerwoman's story is only one thread in the larger tapestry of black domestic labor that defined the early 20th century. If you were a black woman working in a white home in, say, 1910, your day began well before the family you served had any idea morning existed. You're up at 4:30, maybe 5. You've walked from your own neighborhood, which might be a mile away, maybe 2, because living near white families was tolerated only when it served their convenience, not yours. You enter through the back door, always the back door. The front door is for the family and their guests. The back door is for the help, for deliveries, and for the general category of people the household doesn't want visible from the street. You hang your hat in the kitchen and start the stove. By the time the family stirs around 7, the kitchen should be warm, the biscuits should be rising, the coffee should be percolating, and you should look like you've been there all along, as effortless as the furniture. Your duties are whatever the household needs them to be, which in practice means everything. Cooking 3 meals a day, cleaning every room, washing dishes, ironing clothes, polishing silver, beating rugs, scrubbing floors on your hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of water mixed with lye, minding the children, which often means you're simultaneously the cook, the maid, the nanny, and the emotional support system for a family that considers you part of the house rather than part of the world. The pay is somewhere between $2 and $5 a week, depending on the city and the family. You might receive some meals, usually whatever the family doesn't finish, eaten standing up in the kitchen after you've served and cleared the dining room. You might receive old clothes, hand-me-downs that are presented as generosity, but that you understand are simply what the family would otherwise throw away. Some families are kind, in their way. Some are not. In either case, the power dynamic is absolute. You can be fired for any reason or no reason. If the mistress of the house decides she doesn't like the way you folded the napkins, you're done. If the master of the house decides he'd like something from you that has nothing to do with cooking or cleaning, your options range from compliance to unemployment, and sometimes worse. Black women working in white homes in the Jim Crow South occupied one of the most vulnerable positions in the entire American labor landscape, and the absence of legal protection, union representation, or recourse of any kind made that vulnerability total. And yet, because this story always has an and yet, within this impossible situation, black domestic workers built networks of information, mutual aid, and quiet resistance that sustained entire communities. The cook who brought home leftover food wasn't stealing. She was feeding her family with the scraps of a system that paid her next to nothing. The nanny who taught her own children to read using the same book she read to the white children wasn't being sneaky. She was investing in a future that the entire structure of the South was designed to prevent. The women who gathered on their porches on Sunday afternoons and shared intelligence about which households paid fairly, which ones were dangerous, and which ones could be trusted, were building an informal labor network that predated modern employment agencies by decades. Let's shift now from the kitchen to the rails, because another enormous chapter in the story of black labor in the early 1900s was written on the railroads, and specifically on the tracks themselves. Before the trains could carry passengers and freight across the country, somebody had to lay the steel. And in the South, that somebody was overwhelmingly black. Railroad construction was one of the most physically demanding jobs in America, and it operated on a simple principle: cheap labor in, railroad out. Black work crews, often called gangs, lived in temporary camps that moved along the line as construction progressed. The work involved grading the roadbed, which meant moving, massive quantities of earth with shovels and wheelbarrows. It involved laying cross ties, the heavy wooden beams that support the rails, by hand. It involved driving spikes, the thick iron nails that fasten the rails to the ties, with sledgehammers. Each spike required several heavy blows, and each mile of track required thousands of spikes. The sound of the spike maul hitting iron became a rhythm of its own, and out of that rhythm came work songs, call and response chants that synchronized the labor and kept the crews in time. These work songs were more than just practical tools. They were art. They were communication. They were the direct ancestors of the blues, and through the blues, of jazz, rock and roll, and virtually every form of American popular music that followed. When a black section gang on a Southern Pacific crew sang about John Henry and his hammer, they were telling their own story, the story of a man whose body was the machine, whose labor was the engine of progress, and whose reward was to be used up and replaced. The songs carried sorrow and defiance and humor and endurance, and they traveled along the rail lines the way the trains themselves did, spreading from crew to crew and camp to camp, until they became part of the shared musical vocabulary of Black America. The railroad camps were rough. Housing was whatever could be thrown together quickly and abandoned without regret. Food was whatever was cheapest. Salt pork, beans, cornbread, and coffee that was more imagination than bean. Medical care was functionally non-existent. Injuries were common and often catastrophic. A crushed hand from a misplaced spike, a broken back from a falling cross tie, a leg lost to a runaway cart. If you were hurt badly enough that you couldn't work, you were dismissed. There was no compensation, no disability, no safety net of any kind. You either healed and came back, or you didn't. And either way, the line kept moving. But the railroads offered something that the cotton fields and the turpentine camps didn't. Movement. The very nature of the work meant that black railroad laborers traveled, saw different towns, met different people, and brought back information. A man who laid track from Georgia to Texas came home with stories, with knowledge of other places, other possibilities. The railroads, paradoxically, helped plant the seeds of the Great Migration by showing black Southerners that the South was not the entire world. Now let's talk about the steel mills and the iron foundries, because if you want to understand the full scope of what black workers endured and built in the early 1900s, you have to understand what was happening in places like Birmingham, Alabama, a city that was literally carved out of the earth on the strength of black muscle. Birmingham was founded in 1871, and from the beginning, it was a city built on extraction. Coal from the hills, iron ore from Red Mountain, limestone from the quarries. All three of the raw ingredients needed to make steel sat within a few miles of each other, and the boosters who founded the city dreamed of turning it into the Pittsburgh of the South. What they didn't advertise in their promotional materials was that the labor force making this dream possible was predominantly black, and that the conditions under which they worked would have made Pittsburgh's most exploitative mill owners wince. The iron foundries were infernos. You're standing in a building the size of a cathedral, but instead of stained glass and silence, there's molten iron, and a noise so constant and so overwhelming that old foundry workers eventually went partially deaf. The furnaces run around the clock, and they produce a heat that's difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't stood near one. At the mouth of the furnace, the temperature can exceed 2,000 degrees. The air shimmers. The sweat evaporates off your skin before it has a chance to drip. You're feeding the furnace with coal and limestone and iron ore, or you're drawing off the molten metal into molds, or you're breaking apart the cooled castings with hammers and chisels. Every step involves heat, weight, and the very real possibility that one wrong move could cost you a limb or your life. Black workers in the Birmingham foundries were concentrated in the most dangerous and physically demanding jobs. They were the furnace tenders, the labourers who shoveled raw material into the flames. They were the casters who handled the molten iron. They were the labourers who cleaned the slag, the waste material that accumulated in heavy, sharp-edged chunks around the furnaces. White workers, when they were present, typically held the supervisory positions, the skilled craft jobs, and the roles that involved less physical risk. The racial hierarchy of the foundry floor mirrored the racial hierarchy of the society outside it, with one critical difference. Inside the foundry, the heat didn't discriminate. Everyone was miserable. But black workers were more miserable, more often, for less pay. The pay differential was systematic and deliberate. Coal companies in Alabama were documented using wider screens to weigh coal mined by black workers than they used for white workers, which meant that black miners produced the same amount of coal but got credit for less of it. In the foundries, black workers were paid less per hour than white workers doing equivalent labor, and the skilled trades that offered higher wages were reserved exclusively for white men. The gap wasn't accidental. It was architecture. Despite all of this, black steelworkers and miners built lives. They built neighborhoods around the mills and mines, communities with churches, schools, mutual aid societies, and the kind of dense social fabric that emerges when people who share common struggles live close together. On Saturday nights, the neighborhoods around the Birmingham foundries came alive with music, cooking, and the kind of determined joy that refuses to wait for perfect conditions. Barbershops became forums for political discussion. Churches became organizational headquarters. Women ran informal businesses out of their homes, selling food, doing laundry, providing childcare for families where both parents worked in the mills. Let's talk about food for a moment, because the story of how black workers ate in the early 1900s is a story about both deprivation and genius. If you were a black worker in the South around 1910, your diet was shaped by two forces, poverty and creativity. The staple foods were what was cheapest and most available. Cornmeal, because corn grew easily and ground cheaply. Salt pork, because it was the least desirable cut of the cheapest meat. Molasses, because refined sugar was too expensive. Sweet potatoes, because they grew in poor soil with minimal tending. Collard greens, because they were practically indestructible. Black-eyed peas, because they added protein where there was almost none. Fatback, because it was the rendered fat from the parts of the pig that nobody else wanted. From these ingredients, which read like a list of what's left after everyone else has taken what they want, black cooks created an entire culinary tradition. They brought techniques and flavor profiles that had survived the Middle Passage from West Africa. The use of okra as a thickener, the one-pot cooking method that became gumbo and jambalaya, the deep frying that turned cornmeal into hush puppies, the slow smoking of meat that became barbecue. They took the parts of the animal that the white household discarded, the intestines, the feet, the head, the tail, and turned them into dishes like chitlins, pig's feet stew, and head cheese that were meals of necessity but also of genuine artistry. In the turpentine camps, where the food was controlled by the commissary and limited to the barest staples, workers supplemented their rations with whatever they could hunt, fish or forage, possum, rabbit, squirrel, catfish from the nearest creek, wild greens from the forest floor. In the mining towns, families planted gardens in whatever small patch of earth the company allowed, growing collards and tomatoes and butter beans between the rows of company houses. In the cities, black women sold plates of food from their front porches and kitchen windows, creating an informal restaurant economy that served workers who had no time to cook and no money for formal dining. Sunday dinner was sacred. Regardless of how meager the rest of the week had been, Sunday was the day when black families pooled their resources and made something that felt like abundance. Fried chicken, when you could get it. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet. Collard greens simmered with ham hocks until they melted into something silky and deeply flavorful. Macaroni and cheese, sweet potato pie, peach cobbler if the season was right. The Sunday table was where family and community converged, where children learned that food was more than sustenance. It was culture, it was love, it was a quiet declaration that no matter what the world took from you during the week, it couldn't take this. Now, there's another dimension to the story of black labor in the early 1900s that we haven't touched on yet, and it's one that connects the fields, the mines, the kitchens, and the wash tubs to something larger. Because throughout all of this suffering and all of this exploitation, black workers weren't just enduring. They were building institutions, building communities, building the infrastructure of a parallel society that could sustain black life in a country that was actively hostile to black existence. The black church was the anchor. In every community, whether it was a sharecropping settlement in the Delta, a turpentine camp in the Florida piney woods, a mining town outside Birmingham, or a black neighborhood in Atlanta, the church was the first institution established and the last one standing. It served as a house of worship, a school, a meeting hall, a mutual aid society, a political organizing space, and a cultural center. The preacher was often the most educated person in the community, and his role extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He was a mediator, an advisor, a spokesman, and sometimes the only person willing to speak on behalf of the community to the white power structure. Fraternal organizations and mutual aid societies were the second pillar. Groups like the Colored Knights of Pythias, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, and dozens of local benevolent associations provided what the government and employers refused to. They paid for funerals. They provided small loans. They offered insurance against illness and injury. They gave members a sense of belonging and dignity in a society that was organized around the principle that black people deserved neither. And then there was the most radical act of all, education. Despite laws in some states that made it illegal to educate black people, despite the absence of public funding for black schools, despite the hostility of a white power structure that understood perfectly well that an educated workforce is harder to exploit, black communities built schools. They pooled their money, their labor, and their scarce free time to construct buildings, hire teachers, and create educational opportunities for their children. The Rosenwald Schools, a partnership between black communities and the philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, eventually built more than 5,000 schools for black children across the South. But the impetus came from the ground up. Communities contributed land, labor, and money. Families sacrificed to keep their children in school when every economic pressure pointed toward the fields. This is what makes the story of black labor in the early 1900s more than a story of exploitation. It's a story of people who, while being systematically crushed by every institution in American society, managed to build a parallel civilization, imperfect, underfunded, always under threat, but theirs. Every dollar that a washwoman earned and put toward her children's education was an act of defiance. Every mutual aid payment was a middle finger to a system designed to ensure that black suffering had no remedy. Every Sunday sermon was a declaration that the people in those pews mattered, that their lives had meaning, and that the current order of things was not the final word. Let's step back into the experience of a specific kind of work that we haven't fully explored yet. One that would eventually carry hundreds of thousands of black Southerners into a different future. Lumber. The lumber industry in the early 1900s South was a beast of staggering proportions. The vast forests of pine, cypress, and hardwood that covered millions of acres across the region represented an almost unimaginable quantity of wealth, and the companies that harvested them needed an equally vast labor force. That labor force was, predictably, disproportionately black, and the conditions in the lumber camps shared many of the worst features of the turpentine camps, the coal mines, and the cotton fields, combined with a few uniquely horrifying elements of their own. Felling trees in the early 20th century was done primarily with axes and crosscut saws. You're standing at the base of a pine tree that's 60, 70, maybe 80 feet tall, swinging an axe into the trunk with a precision that takes years to develop. The tree has to fall in a specific direction, and if you miscalculate, it falls on you. Crush injuries were the leading cause of death in the lumber camps, and they happened with a regularity that made the work an ongoing gamble with mathematics and gravity. Once the tree was down, it had to be hauled to the mill. Before the widespread use of railroad spurs and steam-powered skidders, this often meant dragging the logs with teams of mules or oxen, or floating them down rivers and creeks to the nearest sawmill. The sawmills themselves were places of extraordinary danger. The massive circular saws that cut the logs into lumber moved at speeds that could sever a limb in the time it takes to blink. The noise was deafening. Sawdust filled the air so thickly that workers breathed it like a second atmosphere, and the long-term effects on their lungs were devastating. Lumber camps, like turpentine camps, were isolated. Company towns sprang up around the mills, complete with company housing, company stores, and company rules. The pattern was familiar. The company paid in scrip that could only be spent at the company store. The store charged prices that ensured workers stayed in debt, and the isolation of the camp meant there was nowhere else to go. Escape was difficult, and for workers who had been funneled into the system through peonage or convict leasing, it was almost impossible. But the lumber industry also created something unexpected: skill. Black lumber workers developed expertise in felling, milling, and finishing wood that made them among the most skilled craftsmen in the South. Black carpenters, millwrights, and timber cruisers, the men who surveyed forest tracts and estimated their value, possessed knowledge that was irreplaceable. And that knowledge, like the washerwoman's trade, became a form of economic power, however constrained. A man who could read a tree, who could predict where it would fall and how many board feet of lumber it would yield, was valuable in ways that the broader economic system couldn't entirely suppress. And skill wasn't the only thing that traveled through the lumber camps. Stories did too. Information about where the pay was better, which camps had bosses who used the whip, and which ones at least let you eat enough to keep standing. Men who moved between camps carried knowledge the way the Pullman porters would later carry newspapers, quietly, deliberately, and with an understanding that what they were spreading was more valuable than anything the commissary sold. But the lumber camps weren't the end of the industrial story. Not even close. Because the early 20th century South was industrializing, slowly and unevenly, but unmistakably. And every new industry that emerged found its way to the same labor source. Black hands built the bricks that built the buildings, that built the cities, that built the New South. And I mean that literally. Brick making in the early 1900s was work that belonged to an older world. You're standing in a clay pit, waist deep in heavy, wet earth, shoveling it into molds that shape it into bricks. The clay is dug by hand, mixed with water, pressed into wooden frames, and left to dry in the sun before being fired in a kiln. The kiln is essentially a massive oven, and the men who tended it worked in temperatures that rivaled the iron foundries. Loading the kiln meant carrying hundreds of pounds of raw bricks, stacking them in precise patterns that allowed the heat to circulate, and then feeding the fire for days. When the kiln was opened, the finished bricks were still hot enough to blister your hands through heavy gloves, if you had gloves, which many workers didn't. Convict labourers made up a significant portion of the brick-making workforce in the South, and the conditions in the brick yards were among the worst documented in the convict leasing system. Workers were beaten for failing to meet quotas. They were chained at night. They were fed so little that malnutrition was the baseline condition rather than the exception. And the bricks they made went into courthouses, churches, schools, banks, and private homes across the region. Buildings that still stand today, their walls holding the compressed labor of men who were never paid for building them. Here's the thing about all of these industries: the cotton, the turpentine, the coal, the lumber, the bricks, the iron. They weren't separate stories. They were one story. One enormous, interconnected system of extraction that turned black bodies into fuel for the American economy. The cotton clothed the industrial North and fed the textile mills of England. The turpentine sealed the ships that carried that cotton across the ocean. The coal powered the factories that processed it. The lumber built the homes and offices of the merchants who traded it. The bricks built the banks that financed it. And at every stage of this chain, from raw material to finished product, the labor that made it possible was disproportionately black, disproportionately underpaid, and disproportionately invisible. Let's talk about tobacco, because we haven't yet, and its story adds another layer to the picture. The tobacco factories of Virginia and North Carolina were major employers of black labor in the early 1900s, and the work inside them was a specific kind of miserable that deserves its own description. Tobacco processing involves several stages, each one assigned along strict racial and gender lines. Black workers, both men and women, were typically assigned to the stemming rooms, where the leaves were stripped from their central veins by hand. The work was repetitive, the pace was relentless, and the air in the stemming rooms was thick with tobacco dust that coated your lungs and gave you a cough that never fully went away. The smell was everywhere, sweet, thick, slightly nauseating. It permeated your hair, your skin, the clothes you wore home. After a shift in the stemming room, you carried the smell of tobacco with you like a second skin, and your family knew where you'd been before you walked through the door. Women who worked the stemming lines developed hands stained dark brown from the nicotine, a visible marker of their occupation that followed them into church, into the market, into every public space they entered. Tobacco factories were also one of the few industrial workplaces in the South where black women were employed in significant numbers outside of domestic service. This gave them access to wages, however small, and to the kind of shared workplace experience that could become the basis for collective action. In 1943, black women tobacco workers in Winston-Salem would stage one of the most important labor strikes of the war era, but the seeds of that action were planted decades earlier in the stemming rooms of the early 1900s, where women worked side by side and talked about what fairness might look like. Let's step away from the factories and the fields for a moment and talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in the story of black labor. The body. Specifically, what all of this work did to the human body over time. Because the physical toll of black labor in the early 1900s is a story of systematic destruction that the medical profession largely ignored. If you were a black worker in 1910, your relationship with your body was defined by its utility. Your body was the tool, the machine, the thing that made the work possible. And like any machine run without maintenance, it broke down. Sharecroppers developed chronic back problems by their 30s, the accumulated result of years of bending over cotton rows. Coal miners developed the hacking cough that would later be identified as pneumoconiosis, black lung disease, caused by years of breathing coal dust in unventilated shafts. Turpentine workers suffered chemical burns on their skin and damage to their lungs from constant exposure to volatile organic compounds. Washerwomen developed arthritis in their hands and shoulders from decades of scrubbing and wringing. Iron foundry workers went deaf from the constant roar of the furnaces. Brick workers developed chronic joint problems from the repetitive heavy lifting. Medical care for most black workers was functionally non-existent. In rural areas, the nearest doctor might be 20 miles away, and even if you could reach him, the chances of him treating a black patient were uncertain at best. In the company towns, the company doctor was paid by the employer, which meant his first loyalty was to the company, not to you. Patent medicines and home remedies filled the gap, passed down through generations of women who served as the de facto healthcare providers of their communities. Roots, herbs, poultices, teas made from plants that had been part of African healing traditions and had been adapted to the flora of the American South. Some of these remedies were genuinely effective, some were not. But they were what was available, and the women who administered them, the root workers and the healers, were figures of enormous importance in communities that the formal medical establishment had abandoned. Pellagra was endemic among sharecroppers, a nutritional deficiency disease caused by a diet almost entirely devoid of niacin. The symptoms were brutal: skin lesions, digestive problems, and eventually mental deterioration. It killed thousands of black Southerners in the early 20th century, and for years, the medical establishment insisted it was an infectious disease rather than a nutritional one, a misdiagnosis that delayed treatment and allowed the death toll to climb. When it was finally understood that pellagra was caused by the same poverty diet, the cornmeal and fatback monotony that the sharecropping system imposed on its workers, the implications were clear. The system wasn't just exploiting black labor. It was killing black workers through malnutrition and then blaming them for being sick. Malaria was another constant companion, particularly in the lowland areas where cotton and rice were cultivated and where the turpentine and lumber camps were situated. Mosquito-borne and often fatal, malaria swept through black communities in seasonal waves, and the treatment, quinine when it was available, was often beyond the financial reach of workers earning a few dollars a month. Children were especially vulnerable, and the infant mortality rates in black communities in the early 1900s South were catastrophic by any standard. Let's talk about the children more directly, because they're the part of this story that hits hardest and gets told the least. In the sharecropping system, children weren't children in the way we understand the term today. They were economic units. A family with 6 children had 6 additional workers, and the system counted on that. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to help with light chores, fetching water, feeding chickens, minding younger siblings. By 7 or 8, they were in the fields. By 12, they were doing nearly adult levels of work, chopping and picking cotton, hauling water, tending livestock, and in the case of girls, beginning the domestic labor that would define their adult lives. Education was the great casualty. In theory, the South had public schools for black children by the early 1900s. In practice, these schools were woefully underfunded, open for only a few months each year, and staffed by teachers who were themselves products of a deliberately impoverished educational system. The school year was built around the agricultural calendar, which meant that the months when children were most available to learn, winter, were also the months when the schools were most likely to lack heat, supplies, and sometimes a building. Many black children in the rural South received fewer than 4 months of formal education per year, and many received none at all. But the desire for education burned with an intensity that the system could never fully extinguish. Families sacrificed astonishing amounts to keep their children in school even for a few months. A mother who earned $4 a month washing clothes would set aside a portion to buy a slate and a reader. A father who worked the cotton fields from dawn to dusk would spend his Sunday evenings teaching his children the alphabet by lamplight. The commitment to education wasn't abstract. It was strategic. Black families understood, with a clarity born of lived experience, that the only way out of the cycle was knowledge. The landlord could cheat you at settling time because you couldn't read the ledger. The commissary could overcharge you because you couldn't do the math. Education was the tool that would eventually break the system's hold, and families pursued it with a determination that bordered on the sacred. And this brings us to resistance, because the story of black workers in the early 1900s is incomplete without understanding the many forms that resistance took beyond the dramatic moments of strikes and organized protest. Resistance was everywhere, and it was mostly quiet. The sharecropper who planted a secret garden in a remote corner of the property, growing food that the landlord didn't know about and couldn't claim a share of, was resisting. The turpentine worker who deliberately underreported his tally to slow the pace of his own exploitation was resisting. The domestic worker who taught her employer's children to say please and thank you to the hired help, subtly altering the household's racial dynamics one polite word at a time, was resisting. The cook who told stories from the Bible about Moses and Pharaoh in a voice loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear was resisting. Work slowdowns were a common and effective tactic. In the cotton fields, workers learned to calibrate their pace just below the threshold that would trigger punishment, but significantly below the maximum output the landlord wanted. In the mines, experienced workers knew exactly how to appear busy while producing less than the foreman expected. These weren't acts of laziness. They were acts of labor negotiation conducted without the benefit of a union, a contract, or any legal protection. They were the weapons of people who had nothing to bargain with except the pace of their own bodies. Theft, or rather reclamation, was another form of resistance that the historical record tends to judge harshly, but that the context makes understandable. When a sharecropper's wife took a chicken from the landlord's coop, she wasn't stealing. She was recovering a fraction of the value that the landlord had stolen from her family through rigged accounting. When a turpentine worker pocketed a tin of sardines from the commissary, he wasn't committing a crime. He was rebalancing an economic equation that was designed to keep him perpetually in deficit. The moral calculus of theft changes significantly when the person you're stealing from has been systematically robbing you for years. And then there was the ultimate form of resistance: leaving. The decision to leave the South, to walk away from the cotton fields, or the turpentine camps, or the mines and head north, was the most consequential choice millions of black workers would ever make. The Great Migration, which would eventually move 6 million black Americans from the rural South to the urban North and West, didn't begin with a single dramatic moment. It began with individual decisions made in kitchens and on porches and in church pews by men and women who looked at the system they were trapped in and decided that the risk of the unknown was preferable to the certainty of exploitation. Those decisions were acts of courage that deserved to be called what they were. Escape. Not escape from slavery, technically, but escape from a system that used every tool short of legal enslavement to achieve the same result. The sharecropper who packed his family's belongings into a suitcase, snuck away before the landlord could stop him, and boarded a northbound train was taking a risk comparable to running the Underground Railroad. The stakes were different, the dangers were different, but the fundamental act of choosing freedom over familiar misery was the same. But that's a story for another night. Tonight we've been in the early 1900s South, and we've seen what it looked like from the inside. We've felt the cold of the pre-dawn cabin and the heat of the midday cotton field. We've smelled the pine resin of the turpentine camp and the coal dust of the Birmingham mines. We've heard the work songs of the railroad gangs and the blues coming from the juke joints and the splashing of water in the washerwomen's yards. We've met sharecroppers and miners and porters and washerwomen and domestic workers and lumbermen and brickmakers. And every single one of them was doing something that the history books too often fail to recognize. They were building America, not as a metaphor, as a literal physical economic fact. The company towns deserve a longer look because they were the physical expression of everything we've been talking about. If you've never seen a company town, imagine this: a grid of identical houses, small, unpainted, thrown together from rough-cut lumber, lined up along unpaved streets with names like First Street, Second Street, and so on, because imagination wasn't part of the budget. Each house belongs to the company. The store at the center of town belongs to the company. The church, if there is one, sits on company land. The school, when it exists, was built by the workers themselves on whatever patch of ground the company designated. In the coal towns of Alabama, the company houses for black workers were invariably located on the worst ground, at the bottom of hills where water collected, near the rail lines where the noise and coal dust were thickest, downwind from the coke ovens that burned around the clock and filled the air with sulfurous fumes that stung your eyes and lined your throat with grit. The houses for white workers were uphill, upwind, and slightly larger. The company store served both, but the credit terms, the prices, and the treatment you received when you walked through the door varied considerably depending on which side of town you lived on. Rent was deducted automatically from your pay. If you were a free miner, not a convict laborer, you received a pay envelope at the end of the pay period that had already been reduced by the cost of your house, your coal for heating, your water, your lamp oil, and whatever you charged at the company store. In many cases, the deductions exceeded the wages. You'd open your envelope and find nothing, or worse, a slip informing you that you still owed. This was the same debt trap as sharecropping, translated from agriculture into industry, and it operated with the same mathematical precision. But inside those company houses, behind the thin walls and beneath the leaking roofs, something remarkable was happening. Family life. Genuine, complicated, resilient family life. A wife who worked the mine boss's kitchen came home to her own kitchen and cooked for her own family with whatever she'd managed to bring, barter, or grow in the thin strip of yard behind the house. children who spent their days in the tipple, the sorting shed where coal was graded and the youngest workers were employed, came home to parents who demanded they practice their letters. Grandfathers who could barely straighten their backs from decades of swinging picks sat on the porch and told grandchildren about where the family came from, about the old home place, about people and places that existed now only in memory and the determined act of retelling. The quilt was more than a blanket. In black households across the South, quilting was an art form with roots that stretched back to West Africa, and the quilts that hung on company house walls or covered corn shuck mattresses carried patterns and colors that held meaning beyond decoration. They were family records, community symbols, and in some traditions, navigational tools. The story that certain quilt patterns served as coded guides for the Underground Railroad is debated by historians. But what's beyond debate is that the quilts themselves were extraordinary, works of art made from scraps and necessity, transforming discarded fabric into something beautiful in the same way black cooks transformed discarded food into cuisine, and black musicians transformed the sounds of labor into song. Let's go deeper into the spiritual life, because the church wasn't just an institution. It was the beating heart of black community life in the early 1900s, and what happened inside those walls was as important as anything that happened in the fields or the mines. Sunday morning was transformation. You put on your best clothes, which might be patched and faded but were pressed within an inch of their lives, because the washerwoman's skill applied to her own family's garments with the same rigor she brought to the white family's linens. You walked to a building that might be a proper church with a steeple and pews, or might be a brush arbor, an outdoor meeting space with a roof of woven branches and walls of nothing but faith and fresh air. You sat among people who, like you, had spent the week bent over in service to someone else's prosperity. And then the singing started. The spirituals were something beyond music. They were theology and history and resistance woven into melodies that could make the rafters tremble. When a congregation sang "Go Down Moses," and the lyrics said, "Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go," everyone in that room understood that Pharaoh wore a different face in every generation, but the demand for liberation was eternal. When they sang "Steal Away to Jesus," the double meaning was present and deliberate. Steal away from the master, steal away from the system, steal away to a place where your soul belongs to you. These songs had been born in slavery and refined through generations, and in the early 1900s, they carried the same freight they always had, a defiance disguised as devotion, a political statement wrapped in a prayer. The preacher's sermon was the week's keynote address, and the best preachers were performers, intellectuals, and community leaders rolled into one. They drew from the Bible with a selectivity that was anything but random. Exodus was the central text, the story of an enslaved people delivered from bondage, and its parallels to the Black American experience were not subtle and were not meant to be. The congregation didn't need the allegory explained. They lived it. When the preacher raised his voice and the deacons raised theirs in response, and the whole church began to rock with a call and response rhythm that drew from African worship traditions preserved across centuries and oceans, what you were witnessing was the creation of one of the most powerful cultural forces in American history. After the service, the churchyard became a social gathering space where families mingled, news was shared, courtships were conducted under the watchful eyes of every elder within a mile, and the business of community life was transacted. Who was sick and needed food brought to their door? Who was behind on their dues to the burial society? Who had heard from a cousin in Chicago about factory jobs that paid real wages? Who was thinking about leaving? The church was the internet before the internet existed, the social network before the term was coined, and the mutual aid fund before the government acknowledged that black citizens might require aid. Now, we've talked about what black men did in the mines and the fields and the lumber camps and on the docks. We've talked about what black women did at the washtubs and in the white folks' kitchens. But we haven't fully explored the overlap. The fact that many black women in the early 1900s worked what amounted to 2 full-time jobs simultaneously, one for wages and one for survival. The black woman who cooked for a white family 6 days a week came home to cook for her own. The woman who cleaned a white family's house came home to clean her own. The woman who raised white children came home to raise hers, often in the few hours between finishing one job and beginning the next. She mended clothes by lamplight. She tended the garden in the early morning or the late evening, the only hours the day left unclaimed. She managed the household budget, such as it was, stretching pennies into meals and months, and the thin miracle of making it to the next pay period. She was often the primary income earner, because her husband's wages from the mine or the field were even more unreliable than hers, subject to the whims of weather, crop prices, and an employer's mood. The physical toll of this double burden was staggering. Black women in the early 1900s aged visibly faster than their white counterparts, not because of any biological difference, but because of the sheer volume of labor packed into every day. The hands of a 30-year-old washerwoman looked like the hands of a 50-year-old. The backs of women who spent decades bending over both the cotton rows and the washtubs carried damage that modern medicine would classify as chronic industrial injury. But there were no sick days. There was no disability. There was only the next morning and the next load of laundry and the next meal to cook and the next child to feed. And somehow, impossibly, within this exhausting cycle, these women also managed to be the cultural backbone of their communities. They organized the church socials. They ran the burial societies. They maintained the networks of mutual aid that kept families from falling through the cracks. They taught the children. They tended the sick. They comforted the grieving. They held the community together with the same hands that held the scrub board and the iron and the hoe. And the fact that any of them survived long enough to see old age is a testament to a resilience so profound that the word barely captures it. The community these women built and maintained wasn't just a support system. It was a counter-narrative. In a society that insisted black people were inferior, incapable, and undeserving, the existence of functioning, loving, culturally rich black communities was itself an act of rebellion. Every child who learned to read was a contradiction of white supremacy's central claim. Every family that stayed together despite the system's best efforts to pull them apart was proof that the human spirit is harder to break than any economic model predicts. Every Sunday dinner, with its fried chicken and its cornbread and its sweet potato pie, was a feast of defiance, a statement that the people at this table matter, that their labor has value beyond what the ledger says, and that joy is not a privilege reserved for those who can afford it. Now let's travel to the river, because no account of black labor in the early 1900s would be complete without talking about the men who built and maintained the levees along the Mississippi River, one of the most dangerous and least remembered chapters in the story of American infrastructure. The Mississippi River was and is a force of nature that has its own plans for the landscape. The levee system that keeps it from flooding millions of acres of farmland and drowning entire towns is an engineering achievement of massive scale. And for decades, the labor that built and repaired those levees was performed almost entirely by black workers, many of them pressed into service through the same mechanisms of debt peonage and forced labor that powered the turpentine camps and the mines. Levee work was elemental. You're shoveling earth, mountains of it, wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of heavy, wet clay, moved from the borrow pit to the levee line, dumped, packed, shaped, and repeated. The borrow pits filled with water, and you were often working knee-deep in it, surrounded by mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever. The heat along the river bottoms in summer was suffocating, a wet blanket of humidity that pressed down on you with physical weight. You worked in crews, and the pace was set by the foreman, who answered to the levee board, who answered to the plantation owners whose land the levees protected. The workers who actually moved the earth had no voice in any of it. During flood emergencies, the work became frantic and even more dangerous. Black workers were conscripted at gunpoint during the great floods of the early 20th century, pulled from their homes and their jobs and forced to the levee line to sandbag against rising water. The Great Flood of 1927, which inundated 27,000 square miles across 7 states, exposed the system in all its brutality. Black workers were held in armed camps along the levees, forced to work without pay, shot at if they tried to leave, and in some cases, deliberately marooned on islands of high ground, while white communities were evacuated by boat. The Red Cross relief camps that followed the flood were segregated, and black refugees were held in conditions that resembled the plantation labor camps they thought they'd escaped. The 1927 flood was a turning point, not because it ended the exploitation, but because it showed millions of black Southerners, in the starkest possible terms, what their lives were worth in the calculus of the white power structure. The answer was less than the cotton, less than the levees, less than the mules, and that realization, for many, was the final push toward a decision that was already forming in the minds of black workers across the South. If the South won't have us as people, maybe it's time to go somewhere that will, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in the early 1900s a little longer, because there are still parts of this world that deserve to be seen. Let's talk about the docks. Port cities like New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, and Mobile were lifelines of the Southern economy, and the men who loaded and unloaded the ships that passed through those ports were among the most physically powerful workers in America. Longshoremen, as they were called, spent their days hauling cotton bales, lumber, barrels of turpentine and molasses, sacks of rice and sugar, and crates of manufactured goods from ship to shore and back again. The work was done almost entirely by hand, with the help of ropes, pulleys, hooks, and the kind of brute strength that came from years of practice and necessity. The docks were one of the few workplaces in the Jim Crow South where black and white workers labored in close proximity, and the result was a complex web of cooperation and competition that produced some of the era's most interesting labor dynamics. In New Orleans, black and white longshoremen worked under a system of alternating gangs, where crews traded off loading duties in a rough approximation of equality. This wasn't born from any particular racial enlightenment. It was a practical response to the fact that both races were essential to getting the work done, and that a strike by either group could shut down the port. The dock, workers' unions were among the most interracial labor organizations in the South, and their history is a complicated story of solidarity and betrayal, of moments when black and white workers stood together against the shipping companies, and moments when the companies successfully drove a wedge between them. But the docks provided something that many other workplaces denied black workers entirely: a visible, public role in the economy. When you're the man loading the cotton onto the ship that's carrying it to England, your labor is impossible to hide, impossible to erase. You're standing at the intersection of local work and global commerce. And even if nobody thanks you for it, you know what you're worth. Now let's return to that cabin in the Delta, or that shack in the Turpentine camp, or that company house outside the mine, because we need to talk about what happened when the work was done. Not just the eating and the sleeping, but the living. Because black workers in the early 1900s didn't just labor, they lived. And the way they lived, the culture they created in the margins and the after hours, is one of the most extraordinary stories of creativity and resilience in American history. Saturday night was the fulcrum of the week. It was the one night when the work stopped, when the body could rest, and when something resembling joy was allowed to surface. In the cotton communities, Saturday night meant the juke joint. If you've never been inside one, even in your imagination, picture this: a one-room shack, maybe a converted barn or a cabin slightly larger than the others, lit by kerosene lamps and candles. There's a plank bar in the corner selling corn whiskey and homemade beer. There's a musician, maybe two, playing guitar and harmonica. The music is raw and immediate, a 12-bar blues that's being invented in real time, pulling melodies from the work songs of the fields and the spirituals of the church and turning them into something new, something that speaks to the specific exhaustion and longing and stubborn joy of this particular moment in this particular place. The juke joint was the laboratory where American music was being created. Robert Johnson, Son House, Charlie Patton, the founding figures of the Delta Blues, all came out of this world. They were sharecroppers' sons and turpentine workers' nephews and laundresses' children. And they took the rhythms of black labor and transformed them into an art form that would eventually reshape the sound of the entire planet. But on a Saturday night in 1910, nobody was thinking about cultural significance. They were thinking about the way the guitar sounded, the way the whiskey burned, the way it felt to press close to someone in the dim light and forget, for a few hours, that Monday was coming. In the mining towns, Saturday night had its own flavor. The neighborhoods around the Birmingham mills, places with names like Tuxedo Junction and Smithfield, had their own music, their own dance halls, their own underground economies. The blues that came out of the coalfields had a harder edge than the Delta sound, something in the rhythm that echoed the percussion of the mines, the steady strike of pick against coal. By the 1920s, these neighborhoods would become the nursery for a style of music that mixed blues, gospel, and an emerging thing called jazz into something the world had never heard before. And in the kitchens and the living rooms and the front porches, there was storytelling. This was the original sleep content, if you think about it. Elders told stories to children, stories that carried the history the schools wouldn't teach and the newspapers wouldn't print. Stories about ancestors who'd been enslaved. Stories about the old ways, about African traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and the centuries of bondage and emerged, changed but unbroken, in the black communities of the American South. Trickster tales about Brer Rabbit, outsmarting Brer Fox, which were never really about animals at all, but about survival, about the way the powerless could outthink the powerful. Ghost stories that made children pull the quilts over their heads. Stories about what it meant to be free, and what it meant when freedom came with conditions. These stories were the foundation of a literary tradition that would eventually produce writers who changed the way America understood itself. But in the early 1900s, they were simply what families did when the lamp was lit and the day was done and the world outside was too dangerous to navigate in the dark. Let's talk about one more form of labor before we begin to draw this evening together. because it's the one that most directly connects the suffering of the early 1900s to the transformation that followed. Let's talk about the Pullman Porters. The Pullman Palace Car Company operated the sleeping cars on America's railroads, and from the 1860s through the mid-20th century, it employed exclusively black men as porters. The job was, in many ways, a microcosm of everything we've been discussing tonight. It required immense physical labor, carrying passengers' bags, making beds, cleaning cars, serving meals. It required emotional labor, maintaining a demeanor of cheerful deference regardless of how passengers treated you. It required you to answer to the name George, because George Pullman's name was on the car, and many white passengers couldn't be bothered to learn the name of the man serving them. The pay was low, the hours were extreme, sometimes 300 hours a month with minimal sleep, and the tips that were supposed to supplement the wages were unreliable and came at the cost of your dignity. You smiled, you nodded, you made the white passenger feel important and comfortable and served because your livelihood depended on it. But the Pullman Porters were also something else entirely. They were the most traveled black men in America. They rode the rails from New York to New Orleans, from Chicago to Los Angeles, from the deep south to the industrial north, and everywhere they went, they carried information. They brought black newspapers from the north into southern communities where such publications were banned. They carried news of job opportunities in the factories of Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh. They were the informal intelligence network of a people on the move. And when the Great Migration began in earnest around 1915, the Porters were among its most important catalysts. In 1925, a Pullman porter named A. Philip Randolph founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first major labor union led by black Americans. It took 12 years of organizing, negotiation, and struggle. But in 1937, the Brotherhood won a contract with the Pullman Company, the first time in American history that a union of black workers had successfully negotiated a collective bargaining agreement with a major corporation. The Porters, those men who answered to George and carried bags with a smile, had built the organizational infrastructure that would directly feed into the civil rights movement. Randolph himself would go on to organize the 1963 March on Washington. From the washtubs to the union halls, from the cotton fields to the railroad cars, from the coal mines to the churches. The story of black workers in the early 1900s is not a story that ends in the places where it begins. It's a story of transformation, of people who were given nothing and built everything, of labor that was stolen and resistance that was earned. So as you lie there tonight, comfortable in a way that the people in this story could barely imagine, think about what it took. Think about the sharecropper's wife who scrubbed other people's clothes to put her son through school, and that son became a teacher, and that teacher educated a generation, and that generation demanded rights that their grandparents had been denied. Think about the coal miner who joined an interracial union in Jim Crow, Alabama, knowing full well the risks, because he believed that solidarity was worth more than safety. Think about the Pullman porter who smuggled copies of the Chicago Defender into Mississippi in his luggage, because he understood that information was liberation. Think about what it means to build a culture, a cuisine, a musical tradition, a literary tradition, an entire civilization, in the spaces between the work that tried to destroy you. Think about the blues coming out of the juke joints, the spirituals rising from the churches, the stories told on the front porches, the laughter in the washerwomen's yards. All of it created in the margins. All of it extraordinary. All of it defiant. The people who lived this history didn't have the luxury of rest without worry. They didn't have mattresses that didn't crunch. They didn't have ceilings that didn't leak, or wells that didn't go dry, or bosses who respected their humanity. They had the dirt floor, and the cotton sack, and the wash tub, and the mine shaft, and the turpentine hack. And from those raw materials, they built a world. They ran so that you could rest. They worked so that their children's children might know what it feels like to be tired by choice rather than by coercion. They sang in the dark because the dark was all they were given, and the songs they made in that darkness became the soundtrack of a nation. So tonight, as the quiet settles around you and your eyes grow heavy, whisper a quiet thank you to the sharecroppers who kept planting, even when the ledger said they owed more than they'd ever earn. To the washerwomen whose hands were cracked and burned from lye soap, but who organized a strike that shook a city. To the miners who went into the mountain every morning, knowing they might not come out. To the Pullman porters who carried more than luggage. To every unnamed, underpaid, overworked black man and woman who built this country with their bodies and asked for nothing more than the dignity of being seen as human. Their labor built railroads that cross continents. Their labor dug the coal that powered the factories. Their labor picked the cotton that clothed the world. Their labor cooked the food, raised the children, washed the clothes, and maintained the homes of a nation that refused to acknowledge them as full citizens. And through it all, they loved each other, raised families, created art, found God, told stories, shared meals, and insisted, against every force arrayed against them, that they were more than what they were made to do. History doesn't always remember the workers. It remembers the presidents and the generals and the industrialists whose names are on the buildings. But the buildings were built by hands that history forgot. And tonight, for at least these few hours, we remembered. Close your eyes now. Let the quiet take you. You've traveled a long way tonight, through cotton fields and coal mines, through turpentine forests and wash yards, through juke joints and union halls and Sunday dinner tables. The people you met along the way, they're still here, in the music you listen to, in the food you eat, in the language you speak, in the insistence, passed down through generations, that every person's labor has worth and every person's life has meaning. They endured what seemed unendurable. They built what seemed impossible, and their courage echoes still, in every fight for fair wages, in every demand for dignity, in every refusal to accept that some people's labor is worth less than others. They worked so that the world could turn, and tonight, as the world turns quietly toward morning, you can rest, knowing that their story has been told. Sleep well, rest deeply, and carry their memory gently into your dreams. Good night.